There are three things you can do to help us out.
One, you can make sure you subscribe to this channel.
Two is you can leave a comment here or on Apple Podcasts.
And three, if you really want to help, you can follow this link to see how you could be a supporter on Patreon. The book is called What They Heard, How the Beatles, Beach Boys and Bob Dylan Listened to Each Other and Changed Music Forever by Luke Meddings. Given that title, it would be wrong to start by asking Luke, what's the book about?
Admirably self-explanatory.
Because there's nothing wrong with saying on the outside what it's all about. It's probably more appropriate to say, how did it start and where, why did you write it? Tell us about it.
Okay, so one of the co-founders of the independent press, Weatherglass, is an old friend of mine called Neil Griffiths. We've been friends since we were in our early 20s and we're in bands together in the mid-80s, late 80s. And been friends, worked together ever since. And someone else we're friends with is Marcus, who was the first person really to kind of introduce me to a lot of fantastic music over the years, pop music that is. And we always go for drinks. We're going for one tonight. And when we were in the bar, we used to talk about, they would tend to talk about books and the great American novel. But when the subject turned to music, I'd really get involved, and we started to talk about when all these great records came out, kind of exactly when, and therefore how they had influenced each other. And although I think in that context I knew the most about it, I still wasn't actually quite sure when all these records had come out. I mean, I might have known it was early 65 or late 65 or whatever. But in fact, the detail is really important because everything was happening so quickly, and they were all the bands were listening to each other so intently, and so when Neil co-founded this press, he asked if I'd like to write a book, kind of explaining all that and elaborating on it. So that's how it started.
Okay, so how did the Beatles enter your life?
Yeah, how old were you when you first discovered all three of those groups, and how did that happen?
Well, when I was growing up, we didn't have any pop music in the house. We had lots of fantastic classical music, lots of great jazz, which I discovered later, but absolutely zero pop music, and we didn't have a TV. So the only time that I sort of heard pop music was when I remember friends singing "Power to All Our Friends" from Cliff Richard's entry to the Eurovision Song Contest, which I hadn't seen.
You've got to start somewhere.
You've got to start somewhere. I mean, and then I remember seeing ABBA, Topical, winning on a friend's TV. So it was all kind of
really? Was
remote.
that? Okay.
Oh,
so
right.
we're talking about in the 70s, mainly here. You're growing up time.
Yeah.
So no television in the house. No kind of Radio 1 in the house or anything like that?
Nothing. It was all mainly Radio 3 with a little bit of the Archers. So there was loads of music.
Right.
Music.
Were you resentful about this?
I didn't know to be resentful. I mean, I really loved the classical music. It didn't feel like anything special.
Right.
It was just music.
Right.
But I think as I started, I guess I must have heard friends talking about it at school. And I know when we got a TV, it was the kind of 75. Yeah, 1975.
Right.
Because I can time it via when I was watching kind of football matches on other people's TVs. And once we had a TV, it was on all the time. Everything was on constantly, forever. So then we had Top of the Pops. And when I was writing the book, I remembered seeing the end of Let It Be on TV, and I was able to time it the way you can by kind of digging.
Oh, when was that? 75? When did they show that? Yes.
Boxing Day 75, I think.
Really? Oh, the full movie.
The movie.
Yeah, when they were still showing the first cut on TV, yeah.
Yes.
What was your impression? Can you remember?
I think I was just fascinated. It's such a compelling scene, and you know, with the policeman and all the trying to get in, and the sort of office workers on the street looking up. I mean, it wouldn't have been the easiest introduction to their music, you know, Don't Let Me Down, etc. But yeah, I think I was just fascinated. Probably by that stage, I was talking to my cousin Marcus and asking him, like, who are they, this group? To be told, yeah, they're the most famous pop group ever. The most famous.
Well, the book is kind of like, it's like detective work, because you've kind of gone through and you've tried to work out the moments when all these three groups physically met and when there was evidence of them actually hearing and reacting to each other's music. But actually, I mean, Dylan came out first, didn't he? March 62, and then Surfing Safari in June 62, Love Me Do October 62, I think. So Dylan got the ball rolling. But I mean, when do you think was the first indication that they'd heard each other, as it were? And was it the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand, which is the big breakthrough in America? Would that have been the first time that Dylan and the Beach Boys would really have noticed them, do you think?
Yeah, I think almost certainly. There were American news crews and magazines covering Beatlemania in autumn 63, but they were pretty skeptical, and they were really covering it as a kind of sociological phenomenon, which they weren't taking too seriously. But then Capitol started to take the sales and the pre-sales figures very seriously, snapped up the Beatles, who had a couple of records released. I think She Loves You came out on maybe Swan Records or something. Yeah. But sold tiny amounts. So I don't think we can know for sure if the Beach Boys or Dylan had come across them before I Want to Hold Your Hand. But I think we can be absolutely certain that they discovered them pretty much at the same time as everyone else in the States did at Christmas 64.
Right.
And the Beach Boys would have seen them on Ed Sullivan, obviously. So what would, they were already in a group. So it wasn't like your Tom Petty's and your Bruce Springsteens and the Byrds all thinking, let's form a group. Yeah. I mean, what would they have thought? Because their big influence up to then have been Phil Spector, I suppose, and Be My Baby and records like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking at it that way, because they were actually the first to put out a single at the end of 61, I think. He says, checking the timeline on the flaps of the book. Okay, it's not on the flap.
I think it was.
Yeah. So, they were. You know, they had this surfing, I think, came out before Dylan. And when you imagine, like, the impact of the Beatles on Dylan was a mainly musical one. And the impact of the Beatles on the Beach Boys must have been a kind of, you know, a career one as well as a musical one, because the Beach Boys were kind of doing what the Beatles were doing with different influences, but they were an electric group. They were very melodic. They wrote their own material. And suddenly there was another group doing the same. Sort of the way they were received slightly better, probably. You know, the Beach Boys were the one pop group, electric group at that time.
This is the interesting thing, that groups were so rare in the United States, weren't they? Yeah. Apart from instrumental groups. That's what people expected groups to do, until the Beatles on Ed Sullivan really is the thing that changes both sides of the Atlantic, really.
Yeah, and the Beach Boys were on tour that winter in Australia and New Zealand. And when they got back around the end of January, you know, it felt on top of the world for about a week, you know.
That is all.
They were mortified. Yeah. I know. Yeah. You talk about the effect of I Get Around. You think that I Get Around was very obviously influenced by the structure of She Loves You, was your theory. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you can hear him picking up very quickly. We know that he studied hard. You know, he studied the Four Freshmen, bizarrely, but that was what gives the Beach Boys their kind of strange sound, that kind of barbershop feel, jazzy barbershop feel. So then studying Phil Spector already, from hearing Be My Baby in the summer of 63, you know, he picked this stuff apart. So I think we can be sure that he would have picked apart what he heard from the Beatles and fed it straight into the music, you know. And I think, I Get Around, I think fun. They're suddenly driving a bit harder and really not, isn't a second wasted, and the production gets a bit richer, which is partly Spector, but I think it's also him kind of marshalling all the kind of nous that he had to hand to combat the Beatles.
What about the non-musical side of this, which I always think is really interesting, that I think that when the Beatles arrived at Kennedy Airport, John Lennon was wearing what was described widely at the time as a Dylan cap.
Dylan cap,
and later
right.
on was advertised in the back of the record mirror or the NME. Get yourself a Dylan cap. Or they then started calling it a Donovan cap. Fair enough. But because hadn't George Harrison bought the first Bob Dylan LP when the Beatles were in Paris, I think, just before they went to
exactly
the States. And on the cover, does he wear that cap on the cover of that album? He does, doesn't he, Mark?
I think he does.
On the first Dylan LP, I think he does.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
And the hat, I'm sorry. I know it's my specialist subject, is things I've got on tops of people's heads. Hair in popular music is hugely important. Hats in popular music are massively important. And the hat, worn by Bob Dylan, said, "I'm not like anybody else." It says, "I'm a working man.
Yeah.
I should be driving a railroad train."
Yeah.
You know, and it's so interesting how people could grab on those things, and that's their sign that they've appropriated that. I mean, did that apply all the way through this? You know, they weren't just listening to each other; they were looking at each other, weren't they?
Yeah. I think that's definitely right. I believe it's a Breton fisherman's cap. Not to say that I've Googled it with the vague intention of buying one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that Dylan here. I come back to hats, but like Dylan hears the Beatles and is kind of stunned by it and keeps quiet about it. Lennon hears Dylan; they're all stunned by Dylan, and he just copies his hat.
And they made a song and dance at the time, didn't they? About how much because there's a photograph of them. I think when they're in Paris making Hard Day's Night Roads, there's a photograph of them with the freewheeling album cover. Isn't it? Yeah, I think it's
freewheeling. Is it freewheeling?
I think it's freewheeling, although actually Times They Are Changing came out in January, pretty much when that picture was taken. But I think the picture they've got is of them with freewheeling. But they talk about how thrilled they are, and they all really like him, and they talk about him in interviews, don't they?
Yeah, they do, and it's kind of interesting how open they are.
How everybody was.
It's a Dylan. Yeah.
What would they have been impressed by?
I think they would have been impressed by how raw it sounded, by how direct it was, because they'd all grown up with the same records, essentially. You know, they'd all been hit by rock and roll at the same age, 55, 56, 57, and all, fallen completely in love with it, and it changed their lives, kind of rewired them. And so, although by this stage Dylan was singing some pretty old folk songs, often in quite new arrangements that he was, let's say, borrowing from fellow folk singers in the village. So although the material was very different, I think they would have recognized some kind of kindred spirit in the approach, because, a lot of the music around at that time in the charts was quite anodyne. The whole sort of narrative about rock and roll dying out by 1960 was pretty much true when you listen to it. And so, I think they would have heard something that was very raw, very direct. The Quarrymen, Lennon's original group, had started out as a skiffle group. George Harrison listened to a bunch of that kind of, what we now call Americana, kind of blues and folk and country in the mid-50s. So they would have recognized, I think, the territory, but above all, they would have recognized the spirit.
And then Dylan did start talking about them, I think, in towards the end of '64, when they had 3 top spots in the Billboard 100. He's saying that they were so far out, I couldn't deal with it. Wasn't that what he said? That there was,
Didn't he say chords? Did he say that later? Because I was going to ask about that point. At the time, I always got the feeling Bob Dylan's response to the Beatles was slightly patronising, but I think he was covering up for the fact that he was dismayed,
internally terrified.
He was terrified.
Yeah, maybe you said it later, but just being absolutely almost despair at hearing that and thinking, what am I going to do?
That quote is from an interview with Rolling Stone,
right,
71.
Oh, right, well, there we are. Yeah.
It's a bit of a delayed admission, and I think it's right. At the time, he says in that interview, I kept quiet about it, or I didn't let on. Or something.
The thing, the one that always strikes me is one of the huge hits in America, in the world, in America, in 1964 is House of the Rising Sun by the Animals, which he'd done on his first jam record.
Yeah.
And that has to be embarrassing. I'm sorry, it does. The record company was going, you could have done this.
Yeah.
You could have put a band on this. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting because he could have done, in the sense that he was already playing with kind of light electric backing at the end of '62. Mixed Up Confusion has some light electric guitar, and it doesn't sound that different to what he starts doing on Bringing It All Back Home. He does tryouts during the freewheeling sessions and things like That's All Right Mama, kind of taking him right back to his first influences, again with a sort of light band backing. So he kind of could have done. There's a nice moment, I think it's in No Direction Home, when Dave Van Ronk, I think, describes Dylan lifting his arrangement of House of the Rising Sun. I think the story is that Dylan says, "Is it okay if I use your arrangement on my record?" And I think it's Dave Van Ronk says, "Well, I'm not sure about that." And Dylan says, "Well, I've just done it."
I'm sure
too late.
And then Dave Van Ronk says, "And I couldn't play it after that." And then says that when the Animals came with House of the Rising Sun, that Dylan couldn't play it after that. So it was like sweet revenge for Van Ronk.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because presumably all of them must have started to feel, because early '63, any of them must have thought we could try things. You never know, they might work. By 1964, they're all feeling, no, try things. It works. Yeah. You know what I mean? The thing you've been timid about trying, no, that's the thing to try. Which is quite an interesting. It's a unique point in popular music, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there's always that warring conservatism. Oh no, the radio won't play it or whatever. And then you'd like to do the adventurous thing. Whereas during this period, suddenly the adventurous thing is the commercial thing.
It's the commercial thing. It's amazing. Yeah.
And they realised that the audience appetite for that was there, didn't they? That the people were prepared to go along with it.
Yeah, I mean, all through that mid '60s kind of high watermark for experimentation, it's still selling. It's still getting to #1.
That's the amazing thing, because what I remember about that time is that pretty much every week you'd hear a record would come out, and it would be like nothing you'd ever heard before. It might be just some tiny instrument or some production technique or some twist in the lyrics or whatever. And it would be, no, you never heard that before, and you never particularly remarked upon it. You just thought, oh, that's the way the world will be.
Didn't you talk about it with people? Didn't you kind of phone people up or talk to them?
Well, there was a new Beatles record, and it was, I don't know what it was, and it would be, I had to see Ticket to Ride. Well, you haven't heard anything like Ticket to Ride before, had you? But it had the, most of all, it was the Beatles. So it was fine. Whatever the Beatles did was absolutely fine. Bob, they used to remark upon things like, I think when I saw the Animals play House of the Rising Sun, which was '64, and before it had come out as a single, they warned us before they played it. It's really long.
Yeah, that's right.
I think it was about 4 minutes.
Yeah.
And when it came out, I think in America, it was two sides of the single, wasn't it? I don't think they dared put it all on one side, whereas in Britain it was all on one side. And so it tended to be things like that. And things like Bob Dylan, it was always, wow, he sings about real things. He sings about things that you could read about in the paper, which is your school teachers all really approved of that.
Dylan was taught education.
I first heard Bob Dylan in the folk club at school. That's how I heard Bob Dylan. You would never have heard the Beatles, And that's the interesting thing about the Beatles and Bob Dylan to me, and which is reflected in your book and that meeting, is that Bob came from that kind of worthy end of things, and they were both jealous of each other. Beatles wanted to be more worthy, and Bob Dylan, boy, he wanted to be more popular.
Definitely. I mean, he was in bands at high school. He was clearly in his almost unique way, very ambitious, and
Incredibly
knew
ambitious.
how to kind of weld his own talent and creativity to whatever was going to take him a bit further, which anyone has to do in that field. And so, yeah, I think it is underestimated how much Dylan took from hearing them, even from meeting them, and from being kind of friends with them when they could meet for a couple of years, in particular. And it's so clear on a song like Love Minus Zero and Bringing It All Back Home, which has just got that kind of lilting acoustic feel that you hear on Beatles for Sale, and A Hard Day's Night, even, that he's definitely interested. And then he comes out as a kind of rock star,
But when they meet in what it was in August '64 at the Delmonico Hotel, that's a real cultural exchange. I always feel that he's looking at them and envying the fact that they're in a group, and it would be so much easier to not be the only one having to take the responsibility and the exposure. And they're envying him and thinking he's writing he's got that mobility and he can change really fast, and he's also writing these really personal songs, and that really had an effect on both of them, didn't it?
Definitely. And I think you feel that in '67 when both Dylan and eventually the Beach Boys, aka Brian, at that point sort of fall silent, and the Beatles have still got each other to kind of G each other up and keep each other going.
All right, let's talk about the Beach Boys a bit. I always got the feeling that the Beach Boys' great tragedy was that they were they never seemed, they could never appear to be more important than the sum of their parts, whereas the Beatles were. The Beatles had kind of magic that the Beach Boys just didn't have. The bit which you can still tell. You look at a picture of you got Sgt. Pepper and you got Pet Sounds. Just think about those covers. There's your problem right there. There's the Beach Boys.
Pet Sounds one of the worst covers ever.
Feeding a goat.
Yeah.
They just couldn't. They didn't develop any mystique at all, did they?
They didn't look great.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Dennis. Well, I suppose
Dennis looked
good.
I suppose Mike Love. Yeah, I suppose there was.
But they're all kind of the way I describe them in the book. I think based on the TAMI show, is they're like all different shapes and sizes. So you got gangly Mike Love, then you got Brian, who's kind of tall, but not that lean even at that point.
Well, he was gawky.
Very, very short and quite tubby. And Al Jardine. So it's a really.
It's really true, actually, because the one of them who should have been out the front was the drummer.
Exactly.
Because he was the one who's physically, he looked wonderful and was confident in himself. The rest of them, that's a really good point, actually. But they never fell together into a picture like the Beatles did. And I suppose partly because there were people, even during those days, there were people leaving and joining and not being there for a while, or they weren't on tour or whatever.
Well, but it is interesting. You could have, if people had thought about it, they might have found a way to do that. Because if you think of the early covers, I'm trying to think of a single '60s cover where they're close in, for example, like the Beatles on pretty much all their early albums from the Beatles on. With the Beatles says, here they are. All you need to see is their faces. You know who they are. Yeah. And the Beach Boys, they're messing about on boats, or they're taking a surfboard down to the beach.
Yes.
Or they're kind of feeding some goats in the zoo. Or Or then they just kind of disappear in cartoon work. So they didn't try. I guess the people around them didn't figure it out.
Well, I don't think they did. I mean, they were catastrophically badly managed, absolutely all the way through their career. Yeah.
What's your account of the story of Rubber Soul, Pet Sounds, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and the way that the kind of competition between the two groups? Can you sum up what happened there? And also there are amazing moments. I think when Brian Johnson at one point played them
Brian Johnson. Bruce Johnson.
What
you mean the famous cricket guy?
Sorry, Bruce Johnson. Bruce Johnson.
That's a good one. There's a book there. I'll tell you.
Johnny's and the Beatles.
Yeah. What's your account of that rivalry?
So I think what I realized sort of pretty much once I finished was that you get initially this very close sort of rivalry / relationship between Dylan and Lennon, and that kind of characterizes the music through to pretty much, I guess, Rubber Soul, I would say. But then
you get Brian Wilson and McCartney.
Yeah, and then McCartney and Wilson have a similar sort of paired relationship where you know, there are similarities as there are between Dylan and Lennon, kind of temperamentally, the instruments they play, probably the way they write even, and then McCartney and Wilson you know, and so they then, I think McCartney becomes the kind of conduit for the Beach Boys' influence in the Beatles, largely, although they all listen to them. So Brian Wilson always cites Rubber Soul as the greatest album of all time, in the same way that he always says that Be My Baby is the greatest record or the greatest song. But what he heard was the US version of it, which is really interesting. All those early Capitol Beatles albums were, up until Pepper, were rearranged. You know, they were going to resequence, and they took stuff, put stuff in, took stuff out, which is unthinkable now. And Rubber Soul, Capitol execs wanted it to sound like a folk rock album, because, you know, the Byrds had basically been the hit of that year, and sort of spawned other groups in the same vein. So the Rubber Soul that Brian Wilson heard is not the one that we grew up on in the UK, and it was more acoustic. And what he loved about it was how coherent it was. He said it kind of fitted together, it hung together like no other album ever.
And also the discovery that Brian Wilson was not touring with the band and was behind working in the studio must have accelerated their desire to give up the stage.
So they meet the two of the Beach Boys, Carl and Mike, in August '65, and on the way in, they meet them in Portland. On the way into Portland, one of the engines on their plane, the Beatles plane, has caught fire. So, you know, it was like a really rocky moment on the tour. And then they meet those two Beach Boys, and they hear that Brian isn't there because he never comes on tour anyway. And they between shows, so between two of their very short, almost inaudible shows, they hear that one of their great rivals in terms of songwriting and production doesn't even bother with it. So yeah, it definitely got the wheels turning.
Right.
And so what Brian Wilson hears in Rubber Soul isn't necessarily what we heard in the UK. It was a different album, different set of songs, different sequencing. But because Pet Sounds is so different to Rubber Soul, you know, you would never listen to Pet Sounds and think, Rubber Soul, you know, never.
No.
I think you have to ask yourself what he heard. And I think if what he heard is that kind of coherence, it was something he was already trying for. We can hear it on the Beach Boys today, where he's got the kind of faster songs in side one, and then this slower side two with the ballads, and it's all got a kind of, again, quite a coherent feel, starting to explore you know, more introspective lyrics and a more melancholy feel, really. And then he picks up on that in Rubber Soul and runs with it, but he kind of runs with it in another direction, which is what leads to Pet Sounds, which is when Bruce, not Brian Johnson, Bruce Johnson, brings it over.
I don't know where that came from.
I think we should change the story.
Absolutely.
No, Freudian slip or a cricketing slip.
So, so how did you go about this book? You must have gone through loads of old music papers and things and tracked every tiny little mention, because I couldn't get over. I was looking at it today, and the incident about I think the Beatles meet the Beach Boys, possibly in Hollywood or something, and some two girls jump from a helicopter into a swimming pool. Yeah. You think those were the days?
Yes,
those are the days. And that was the day off. That was the day that wasn't crazy. When it just,
You think, you know, you could write a book about every little incident like that, couldn't you?
There is so much. I mean, what I would have loved to have done would have been to get some days in reference libraries, but I couldn't because it was lockdown.
Right, of course.
Ferreting online and then just kind of digging as far as I could if I found a reference to something. Sometimes you'd find the image of an article from those days, like something from the Record Mirror from '65.
Yeah.
And then have to kind of zoom in on it and transcribe the relevant bits. But yeah, it was bits and pieces online. But the great thing about online is that you get the video as well. So you get to watch the conferences, you get to watch the whole of the TAMI show and so on.
Well, that's the curse about doing those kind of books nowadays, is the amount of research material just grows exponentially.
Yeah. I mean,
if you went back and did it again now, there'd be more material about
day by day. I agree.
Did you ever consider extending it further beyond Beatles, Beach Boys, Dylan? I think you like the Birds.
The Birds appear quite extensively in it. Yeah,
I love the Birds, and initially they were in there as one of the four artists, and I think the more I worked on it, the more I realized, and it's part of the editing process as well, that they were different. As you said at the start, the Beatles, Beach Boys, Dylan are all recording by the end of '62, but the Birds really come about because of hearing the Beatles in
Hard Day's Night, isn't it?
Yeah. So Gene Clark and Roger McGuinn.
Yeah, they form a group on the basis of that with the same equipment, the same clothes, and
That's an interesting point, isn't it? They're a post-Beatles band.
They are, yeah, and so they emerge. I think I might have said this in the book, kind of fully formed in a way that the others didn't. And their first record is just the Birds sound on the nail forever, and it's a mix of the Beatles, who they wanted to be. Obviously, it's a Dylan song, and it's the Beach Boys arrangement of Don't Worry Baby, basically, with lots of the same musicians.
Right. So what did you find out? What surprised you most of all the things you found out in the course of researching this book?
I think it surprised me when I started to go back to the start, their early years, how similar their backgrounds were. They were obviously different in many readily identifiable ways, but they were all, none of them were wealthy, none of them were kind of dirt poor. They were kind of getting by, but they were going to school, sometimes quite good schools. But none of them, Dylan did some time at university, didn't he? But most of them were just going to leave and do some college and get jobs and stuff when they were 18. So I thought that was interesting. I think it's really striking that they discovered the same music at the same point, which I hadn't sort of been so aware of. They kind of start coming back to it, by 1969, they're all playing That's All Right Mama again, the Beatles in the Let It Be sessions, and Dylan with Johnny Cash. So they have the same, similar backgrounds in different places and in different ways, if that makes sense, but absolutely the same musical influences. And then, it's interesting how, although it's often portrayed as rivalry and competition, which of course it was, as with the Rolling Stones, who were hyped, I believe, at the time as being, the opposite of the Beatles, but they were really good friends. They kind of dipped into each other's sessions, they played each other the acetates. And the same is true of the Beatles and Dylan and the Beach Boys. It's just that they couldn't meet so easily and so often, but they kind of met as often as they could across that period. So they were competitors, but they were friends, and they were, in a sense, sharing the same experience, in the way that you described, David, of just things changing so fast that you, I guess, didn't have time to stop and think too much about it. You just had to react and move on.
But I suppose it's also true to say, I just think as you were saying that their careers all followed a similar kind of timeline, that their furthest out periods were 66, 67, and after which they all sort of realized, can't go any further, really. We go back in a little bit. That's what they all ended up doing, isn't it, really? With varying degrees of success.
Yeah, they kind of retrenched, don't they?
Well, that's interesting. You talk about the fact that at the end of the book, the end of the 60s, the Beach Boys are really on the slide, actually. They're not selling that many tickets, not selling as many records. And that Dylan's gone off and he's no longer at the kind of cutting edge. It's all, music from the Big Pink, and it's Electric Ladyland, and it's Astral Weeks or whatever, or King Crimson. That's the stuff that the people are getting excited about, and the Beatles are simply excelling within the context of the Beatles, but they're not part of any movement anymore.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that all three of them were slightly kind of, slightly out of the frame, really, by the end.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And the Beatles kind of keep the energy up as far as probably the White Album sessions.
Yeah.
And they just, it just isn't quite there anymore. So that, they keep going, but not that much longer.
Yeah.
And there's not much influence, or rather evidence of Dylan being influenced by the Beatles anymore, really, after John Wesley Harding and National Skyline. He's just gone off in a completely different direction, hasn't he?
Yeah, well, he there's a, must be an amazing meeting, it feels that way to us, of the Beatles and Dylan meeting in, I think it's April or May '66. And Dylan plays them acetates from Blonde on Blonde, and they play him acetates from Revolver. And he really takes against Tomorrow Never Knows. So you
don't want to be cute anymore, is it? That line. That's right. Yes.
I don't think
he's such a bitch, isn't he?
I know.
I mean, what?
Takes against it. Why? Envy? Jealousy?
It's the front. But yeah, he kind of takes against it. He then says he doesn't like Sgt. Pepper either. And so I guess in his own way, in quite an instrumental way, via the sessions with the band in spring and summer of '67, he's sort of part of the retrenchment from the experimentation and that more country feel to the records that were coming out. What we now think of as Americana, maybe.
Yeah.
So what's next? Having written this, is there any other comparable triumvirate in any other era of pop music that you could take a similar approach to, do you think? Or is this a unique case?
That's a good question. I am looking at other projects.
Oh, right, okay. You don't have to tell us if you don't want.
I don't.
If you're not at liberty to reveal,
Huh?
You're not at liberty to reveal. Don't worry.
Not at liberty to reveal.
Yeah.
I don't know if there is the same.
No, I don't think there is.
The same triumvirate working in the same compressed time space. I mean, I think there are some of those outside pop music, maybe. I think, but again, simply because of how life was in those days, the timeline is much longer. So if you think of people like Haydn, Beethoven, and Mozart, who were kind of working in the same field, who were progressing the same field incredibly fast, but it happened over a couple of generations. They were also as friendly as they could be, met once, maybe once or twice. I don't think there is one. I don't think there is a parallel. And I think it's sort of unparalleled within pop music in terms of what they achieved in such a short period of time, taking it to such a peak beyond which they kind of realized they couldn't go. And possibly in other art forms as well, simply because of the way that the technology worked at that point and how quickly they were able to react to each other's work.
Because that's the funny thing about the 60s. And people say that nowadays the music business moves really quickly. It doesn't. It moves really slowly.
Yeah.
In the mid 60s, that's when it moved really quickly.
Well, it's infinitely more cautious now, isn't it? It's what we were saying earlier. Is it now doesn't dare take any risks just in case it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
Whereas then the appetite for change was just enormous.
Well, look, it is, according to some bloke who wrote the blurb on the cover, a thoroughly engaging and beautifully written book, says Mark Ellen. There it is, what they heard, how the Beatles, Beach Boys and Bob Dylan listened to each other and changed music forever. And as you say, it's from a small independent publisher called Weatherglass Books. We'll put the link along with this, but do investigate it. It's really terrific.
Excellent.
Thanks for